Thank you for being here with us tonight. My name is Ronen Tzadok. I am the Israel Fellow at Syracuse Hillel, and tonight's event was made possible in the partnership with the Office of Veteran and Military Affairs and Syracuse University Army and Air Force ROTC. Let me introduce you, please, Cadet Bauer from the Army ROTC. He'll be our moderator tonight, and he will gonna run the event.
All right, so everyone, so tonight's leadership professional development for ROTC, as well as the Hillel event, is for Izzy Ezegwe. So it is a great honor to have with us Izzy Ezegwe, a decorated squad commander in the Israeli Defense Force. Izzy is the only soldier in the world who lost an arm in combat and then returned to the battlefield. In 2011, the former president, Shimon Peres, awarded him one of Israel's highest military honors. So while he continues to serve in the elite unit in the reserve, Izzy also delivers inspirational talks across the US and internationally. He's appeared on the Huffington Post, Al Jazeera America, and Fox News. The Allgemeiner chose Izzy as one of the 100 people positively influencing Jewish life. He also raises millions of dollars for hospitals, rehabilitation programs, and other charities, such as Birthright Foundation. He has worked with amputee organizations, schools, colleges, universities, and corporate events for companies such as Nike and Apple. So thank you, Izzy, for being here tonight.
My sincere pleasure. Happy to be here with you guys. So I guess just briefly what I anticipate the format of this being is I will just share maybe 15 or 20 minutes of stories. Really more for entertainment than anything else, maybe a little bit of education. And then the part that I'm more excited about is the Q&A, which will really just give you guys the opportunity to direct the conversation or shift it in any direction that you'd like. So I think it's always best to start with more recent experiences. And the one that comes to mind is something that happened just a few years ago when I got called up for the reserves. In Israel, you usually get called up about once a year. Personally, because I live in the US, I actually fly back to Israel to rejoin my unit. And that time when we got called up, it was for about a week and a half, and it was a very difficult training exercise. And they didn't really let us rest or sleep for the first, for the first 36 hours. And when we finally did get a break after lugging around all of our heavy gear and doing all of these drills, we got a break at the top of a very steep hill that we had just climbed. And right when we were going to try to get some sleep, it began to pour. And as a lot of you know, soldiers are at the mercy of the elements. There wasn't exactly anywhere to go. We all started shivering. Some of the veterans had to be medevaced to the hospital with hypothermia. And that was just like a couple days in. And really the whole week and a half followed that theme. It was very difficult. And the only thing that I enjoyed about that experience beyond the service itself and knowing why I was there is the fact that it happened to take place on Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights. And something compelled me to walk around and borrow the assault rifles, the M16s, from some of the officers around me. I didn't tell them why. And I took the straps off of these rifles and I stood 8 of them up in a row. And I put candles inside the barrels. And because it was the 4th night of Hanukkah, I lit 4 of those candles. And you probably shouldn't do that. I mean, I'm sure that's part of the training that they give you guys is don't light candles inside assault rifles. Not only did I do that, but I actually posted a picture of my machine gun menorah on Facebook. I was standing behind it with a big smile, and it said Happy Hanukkah from the IDF Reserves. And I thought it was just a nice photo op, especially because the message that I was trying to give across is that in the IDF, we'd rather use our weapons to spread light, which is like a classic, I guess, biblical thing of turning swords into plowshares. I thought it was a cute idea, but I got a call in the field a few days later because the photo went viral. And the head safety officer of the IDF was not very happy. And I was to be court-martialed. And in the end, I actually got away with it scot-free. I didn't get in trouble, didn't go to jail. And I sincerely believe the only reason that that is the case is because there's no way to handcuff me
and transport me to the facility. So I got away with it. It was a worthy stunt, I guess you could say. And the real question at this point is, why is it that I can't be handcuffed? Meaning, how did I get injured? So in order to understand that, we have to go back quite a number of years. And I have to explain essentially that I drafted in 2008. I decided to volunteer for the IDF, even though I grew up in the States. And it was obviously a very difficult 9 or 10 months of training. I didn't speak a lick of Hebrew when I showed up, but my recommendation to anyone here who wants to learn a foreign language, and it doesn't really matter what language that is, just join that country's military and you will be speaking so quickly. Whether it's French, Swahili, it doesn't matter, because the amount of punishment that you'll accumulate for not knowing what's going on around you requires many extra push-ups and laps around the base. So I learned Hebrew pretty quickly, went through my 10 months of training. And the truth is, by the time we graduated, I really did feel ready for whatever the military was going to throw my way. And my unit was sent home for our final weekend leave before activation. And I was sitting on the couch in Jerusalem with my family. My family made Aliyah as well. They moved to Israel. And I was sitting on the couch and I got a phone call, and I knew right away that something was wrong even before I answered, because I was getting called by my religious commander, my Orthodox commander, and it was the Sabbath. And when I answered, he told me that war had broken out on the border of Gaza. This was Operation Cast Lead at the very end of 2008. And this commander was calling to inform me that our unit was being sent to the border. So without a moment to spare, I threw on my fatigues, I kissed my mother goodbye, and I ran out the door. And for about 2.5 weeks, my unit patrolled the border. We were not sent inside. But because we were outside, we were targeted by hundreds of mortars and rocket-propelled grenades. But somehow it took 2.5 weeks before we got our first piece of bad news in our individual unit. We got back to base early one morning after a stakeout to find out that a captain from our brigade was targeted by a few rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs. He was inside Gaza with his troops, and he died in action. So we were told that we were going to be sent inside for the first time so that we could retrieve his body and bring him home. And I went back to my tent. I had a few minutes to prepare myself mentally, physically, emotionally, whatever it is that one has to do, maybe pray. And I was sitting there contemplating whether or not I should call my mother and tell her the truth about where I was. Because up until that point, essentially from when I left home, when I kissed her goodbye, and every single day when I spoke to her on the phone, I would lie to her. I would tell her that I was on the border of Lebanon, which was very far from the conflict and very quiet at the time. And I told her that the military had us washing dishes. That was my way to protect her. I didn't want her to know where I was. I didn't want her to worry. And now I had to decide whether or not I was going to be honest, because I was about to go into, I guess, a far more dangerous situation. And while I was contemplating, that decision was made for me by a 120 millimeter mortar, which is a very large military grade munition, that landed about half a foot away from me where I was sitting in my tent. And it tore off my left arm on the spot. Because of that, I do remember every single detail from when it happened until I was put to sleep for surgery. It's the kind of thing that you don't forget. And I don't want to share all of those details with you guys now because it doesn't make for a compelling Zoom conversation. But for those of you who are interested, you can actually find my memoir online, probably on Amazon. It's called Disarmed: Unconventional Lessons from the World's Only One-Armed Special Forces Sharpshooter. Should definitely give that a look. If you're still interested by the time I'm done talking. So I do want to focus on just a few things that happened in that brief window between when I got injured, when the arm was blown off, and when I was put to sleep for surgery. So the first is I was brought to the bunker. There were still more mortars falling. I was brought to the bunker for safety. They started to apply a tourniquet. I was given a dose of morphine, which is a really strong and I would argue a really wonderful painkiller. Maybe not something I would recommend if you don't need it, but I definitely enjoyed my first dose of morphine. And an ambulance soon pulled up to the bunker. My stretcher was placed in the ambulance and we drove off. And there were 3 girls sitting above me. One of them bent down to ask me if I was okay. She wanted to know if I'd gotten any morphine. And I looked up at her and I lied. I said, no, I've not gotten any morphine, and I got another wonderful dose. It was also really kind of nice. It's a warm feeling. And the ambulance soon came to a stop. My stretcher was placed on a helicopter that was waiting outside. We took off. We started to head for Soroka Hospital in Beersheba, which is where most injuries coming out of Gaza end up. So it's relatively close. There was a special forces operative standing above me. He wanted to know if I was okay. He asked me if I got any morphine. I looked up at him and I said, no, I have not gotten any morphine. So as you can imagine, by the time we landed at the hospital, I was a little bit loopy, and that's partially my fault. I was definitely self-medicating there, a bit of lying. There was also severe blood loss. But despite that combination of harsh realities, I was actually terrified when we landed at the hospital, because I saw a big grassy clearing, and beyond the clearing there was a chain link fence, and past that fence were reporters that were waiting to capture footage for the news. And I understood even then, despite everything, that if my mother saw that I lost an arm on national television, she would kill me even if I survived the injury. So that actually compelled me to sit up off the stretcher. I grabbed a blanket that was resting by my feet. I used it to cover my face. Unfortunately, my mother did see this on live television. There aren't a lot of big news channels in Israel. They all kind of, I guess, were sharing the same footage. So unfortunately, she actually saw me being rolled into the hospital. Very fortunately, she couldn't tell that it was me because of that blanket that I placed over my face. And I believe that that's probably the only reason that I'm alive and well and here with you guys today, because my mother would have killed me if she saw me get injured on live television. So needless to say, when I woke up after the injury a few days later, it was to a very different reality. Things that I did easily my entire life were suddenly either very difficult and sometimes impossible. So I used to be a lefty, and I did lose my left and dominant arm. And, you know, what became complicated were things that used to be so simple, like buckling a belt or tying a shoe, cutting food, showering, really things that I just didn't have to think about up until that point in life. And to make matters worse, I also woke up suffering from severe phantom pain, which is a very real neurological pain that unfortunately I still, I guess, experience today. I don't want to say suffer from. I have a good quality of life, but it's something that still follows me around like a phantom. But despite both of those things, I knew from the moment that I woke up in the hospital that I wasn't done, that I wanted to continue my service. I wanted to continue contributing. And because of this, I would literally pester everyone who came to visit at the hospital. I would ask them to help me make this happen, all the generals and politicians. But the interaction that stands out most, as far as I'm concerned, is the first time that I told my parents that I wanted to go back. And this was about maybe 3 days after the injury. It was the first time that I was lucid. And I looked up at my parents. They were standing on opposite sides of the hospital bed, and I told them that I wanted to go back. And my father burst into tears. He's not like he doesn't cry very easily. He's a very jovial Canadian man. And he burst into tears nonetheless. And he said, how could you even joke about something like this after what happened to you? You've done enough. It's time to move on. And my mother standing on the other side of the bed, and she says, it's not so simple. If this is what Izzy wants to do, we have to stand behind him. And I'm literally watching them argue back and forth from the bed. And I wasn't focused on my father's fears, which made perfect sense to me. He wanted to protect his son. And I wasn't even focused on the insane strength that my mother was showing by considering such a thing. What mattered to me is that they were both talking about it as if it was possible. They both sincerely believed that if I put my mind to it, if I put my heart into it, I would actually make it back into combat. And that gave me tremendous strength. It gave me the strength to push every general and every politician who came to visit thereafter to help me go back. And it took months. Ronan can tell you afterwards, but Israelis are pretty tough and pretty stubborn. So it definitely took convincing. But after months of asking, I finally found a general that was willing to give me essentially the opportunity to retry for combat, which is unheard of. And when I felt ready, which was quite a while after the fact, almost a year and a half after I was injured, I was reinstated. I went back to base, and I was given 1 month to retake all of the tests that a combat soldier normally has about 8 months to finish, right? So I had to relearn how to shoot, load and unjam an assault rifle, how to do obstacle courses in full combat gear, how to pull grenade pins. I eventually realized I can do it with my teeth like Rambo. That might be a little before your time, those of you on this call. But by the time that month came to a close, I managed to pass all of those tests, as difficult as it was. And I was reinstated to active duty combat. I served for about another 2 years despite the injury. And I ended my active service leading a squad of 13 soldiers through their advanced training, which to me was the highest honor. I sincerely enjoyed that aspect of my service, and doing my best to inspire the next generation of warriors. So that's essentially the story. I want to just maybe focus on 1 or 2 interesting things that happened during the retraining before we move on to the Q&A. The first of which is the obstacle course, which I just mentioned. So this is something, I don't know if you guys have, there has to be something obviously comparable in the American military, but you're wearing all of your combat gear, your water weight, your ammunition, your weapon, your helmet, and you run the obstacle course. And like halfway through the run, there's a 7-foot wall, there's monkey bars, parallel bars, you're crawling under barbed wire. And you have in Israel, you have about 10.5 minutes to finish this test. So the first time that I took this obstacle course test with 2 arms when I was in basic training, I actually failed by 2 or 3 seconds and had to be woken up the next morning to do it again, with the threat that if I didn't complete it that day, I'd have to wake up the next morning and do it again until I finished it, which is wonderful motivation to get it done. And that's why I passed it by 2 seconds that second morning. So my record for the obstacle course with 2 arms was not great, close to failing, passable at best. The first time that I took that test after the injury, when I was attempting to make it back into combat, I went from about 10.5 minutes to about 8.5 minutes, which should tell you enough. It's really mental. It's not physical. You just have to care enough. You have to put in the work. And my record was close to 7.5 minutes by the time I was doing commander training. So that's something that I have to remind myself how much of it is mental. And I think that's true for most things in life. And then the second thing was a lesson that I was taught by my own weapon after the injury. So part of the retraining was relearning how to shoot, load, and unjam an assault rifle. In Israel, we use the TAR-21, the Tavor. It was relatively new, at least the shorter version of it when I was training there. And my trick for loading a gun is to lean it on my knee when I'm kneeling and to pull the loader back. And I thought that would be enough to figure out how to load a gun. What I didn't take into account was that if you're not holding it steady with a second arm, the weapon will jump and the bullet won't catch properly in the chamber and it'll jam time after time. So there I was after all of that bureaucracy of just trying to be given this chance of going back to combat. I'm passing these other tests, and now I'm facing this massive conundrum, which is I can't be a combat soldier if I can't load a bullet into my rifle. And eventually I realized that the only way I was going to be able to hold the weapon stable while I was kneeling, while this weapon is resting on my extended knee, is if I literally bend down and press what's left of my injury onto the butt of the rifle to hold it steady. Now, again, I'm suffering severe phantom pain. This is a relatively new injury. I knew that this would cause severe pain. But the alternative was just packing it up and going home. So I obviously decided to give it a shot. I bent down, I pushed my amputation into the butt of the rifle, and it was so painful that I nearly blacked out. The positive side is that the bullet properly loaded into the chamber and I was able to hit the target. And I did this again and again. It was my only alternative. And eventually what I realized, or what started to happen, is that instead of nearly blacking out, every time I felt that jolt of pain, I would actually get a boost of adrenaline. And it would actually it would slow down time for me, and the lines and the targets would actually get clearer. And my shot actually got better because of this after the injury. Something that I perceived as a weakness ended up becoming a strength or a secret weapon, which is another thing that I found fascinating. All these things that we think are going to be weaknesses in our life, if we do some kind of judo move on it, ends up helping us further if we're willing to look for that out. So those are just two things that I learned during my retraining that I figured you guys might find at the very least amusing, if not able to learn something from it. And that's it. We've gotten to my favorite part of what's going to be the Q&A. So however you guys want to approach this, I don't know if it's Brian or Lauren, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, so I think we're going to run this by, you can drop some, if you have questions, drop them in the chat box, and then we're going to read them from there. I know, starting off, I have a question about, what made you decide to go all the way across the world and join the IDF, being a US citizen, doing that, because I think only 1% of US citizens enlist in their own military. So yeah, what inspired you to, go that far and take that journey?
That's a great question. So it's mainly because I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish household. So we grew up learning about the Bible and all of the historical grievances that the Jewish people have gone through, leading all the way up to the Holocaust. So slavery in Egypt, all the way up to the Holocaust, and the knowledge that the ability for a modern day young Jewish person to protect their tribe, their people, was something that I couldn't pass up on. The truth is, I'm not a shoo-in as a soldier. I don't necessarily have the qualities one would typically think of as soldier-like. I don't like spending weeks in the field without showers. I don't like eating out of the mud or getting shot at. I guess nobody really likes that. But for me, it was really deeper than wanting to be a soldier. It was knowing the history of my people and wanting to take part in protecting them. Oh, guys, give me a second. That's the dog. Let me grab him. Now you get to meet Punch. Okay. This is my best friend Punch. He gave us the opportunity to introduce him. Could you stop, Punch? Relax. We get it. He likes to protect me. Okay.
So it looks like Cadet Little asked you a question in the chat and says, so you stated that you were in charge of 13 other soldiers at one point. How did you lead those soldiers with your injury? Did losing your arm affect how they looked at you at all?
Yes, without question. So there's actually a few different stages of how it was perceived. And all of them are interesting. I will say that most of it actually had to do with my own mindset and less to do with them. Because one of the greater lessons that I learned, thanks to that return to the military after the injury, is that people really tend to see you the way that you see yourself. And I think that's true across the board. It doesn't just have to do with an injury. Whatever you're presenting forward is how people treat you in life. And I actually learned that across 3 different stages, because in the Israeli military, I don't know if there's a parallel to this in the US military, but you're constantly rotating to new groups of soldiers. So it's like an opportunity for a clean slate to present yourself differently. And early on, especially when I was retraining on that base, I had no problem talking about the injury to the point where I was poking fun at it. Israelis have a very dark sense of humor, for better or worse. And at a certain point, it got out of hand. No pun intended. There was just too many jokes. And I decided that on my next clean slate, I would talk about the injury, but I wouldn't poke fun at it. So that was the next stage of things. I moved to a new rotation, new people. I was happy to answer questions, but no poking fun. And I actually had a better experience because of it. I decided to take it a step further by the time I had my own soldiers and to not mention the injury at all, which is easy to do when you have people who aren't really going to ask questions unless that's part of the plan. And frankly, it was amazing. It never came up. I had 4 months with my soldiers where it was just never discussed. It was never asked about. And no, it didn't really affect things in a negative way. I think to the contrary, I think at least for some, it maybe gave a little extra, inspiration or the will to push through, knowing that they had a commander that was doing the same.
Looks like Daniel also posted a question in chat. So, is using a prosthetic prohibited in the IDF? I originally thought you used one, but you said you did all those combat exams with one arm. Do you serve now with just a single arm, or with a prosthetic in the field?
So the short answer is that the only time I wear a prosthetic these days is either on Purim or Halloween to dress as Captain Hook. There's like a very basic prosthetic with a hook at the end of it that I got courtesy of the rehab center, which I really never used. But I was actually really concerned about that starting out. I thought that if I didn't have the newest bionic technology, some kind of like iRobot arm or Terminator arm, then I just wouldn't be able to do combat again. And because of the issues that we have in Israel with the Ministry of Defense, and I think you guys have the same problems here, if not worse, when it comes to the treatment of veterans, I didn't get the arm that I wanted. I was stuck with my Halloween costume. And I discovered very quickly that I didn't really need it to pass those tests in combat. And as a result of that, also realized that I don't really need one in life. So no, I've never really used a prosthetic. I have one gathering dust somewhere in a closet in Israel, but I come as you see me.
I think you mentioned a little bit about how kind of that respect and how your soldiers looked up to you, post the injury. And I think so Gary Ginsberg, a Syracuse 72 alum, put in the comments, can you comment on how well your fellow IDF soldiers initially accepted you back into your unit? So did you see that unit again? Did they?
So I didn't end up with the same soldiers that that I was with when I was wounded. I guess just as an interesting side note, there were actually 4 of us that were hit by the mortars in that particular attack. One was critically wounded. He was hit in the gut and was closest to dying in the field. Another soldier got hit in the femur bone, which is the hardest bone in the body to, I think, break and heal, if I'm not mistaken. You can correct me if I'm wrong, somebody. But his was shattered. And then our light machine gunner got hit across both of his knees. I think what they considered as a light wound. And something that I found inspiring is the fact that all four of us continued our service. So the gentleman who shattered his femur was back in combat within 7 months. He managed to heal up and return to the unit. The gentleman who got hit in the stomach couldn't continue in combat because it was just too much of a mess down there. So he took a non-combatant role, but volunteered to continue his service. And my favorite story is the light machine gunner that got hit across the knees. He actually ran away from the hospital the day after he got injured and went back to the front line, which to me is just, inspiring. And I told you that I went back as well, so we know that part. Yeah, I mean, I think I can only speak from what I saw from my soldiers, but I think that it did inspire them and only helped push them through their training. I didn't really see any negative effects.
Then after fighting to return to combat after your injury, and you were on active duty for a while. So then what made you ultimately decide to go, shift from active to the reserves?
Oh, that's just the way the military is structured in Israel. Unless you're an officer, which I was not, your service ends after 3 years. That's just how it goes. It's a 3-year mandatory service, and then you continue to do reserve duty until you age out, depending on the unit. Some units are 40, some 50. So I was just following the path, I guess you can say. It's not a career in Israel.
Okay, thank you. And there's another question also. It was mentioned that you were honored by Shimon Peres as a student who has grown up learning about him in a Jewish day school. He is known as a promoter of peace in the region. What was your experience being honored by him like?
Well, I can tell you that he had a really firm handshake, and I did meet him towards the end, so that was kind of nice to experience. We only had a few moments together on the stage, but I'll say that it was an honor. As somebody who promotes peace myself, our agendas very much match up, and I enjoyed that experience very much.
And as far as all the cadets here in the crowd, what a piece of advice could you give them overcoming challenges, expected and unexpected? We all just got back last weekend from a pretty cold and a little bit rainy training event. So I'm sure a lot of us were, I guess, going through a little bit of, mental challenges to overcome that coldness. So what advice can you give to these cadets, going through these challenges?
Well, let me tell you this. I still complain about paper cuts. So I don't even know if I'm the right person to be asking about that. I overcame one obstacle, in a really good fashion, I guess. But there's no like, you've learned that lesson and now you have that figured out. It's a constant grind. So I guess the advice would be to keep that muscle sharp, that part of your brain that helps you overcome adversity, whether it's cold weather or long nights. Or any other part of that myriad of things that soldiers go through. But the other side of that is that you guys are already doing it. Like it's an honor to actually share with a group of fellow warriors who are going through it now. You're making it happen. You're already doing the advice that I would give you.
So yeah, okay. Well, thank you. That was pretty helpful, I guess, for all the cadets here. And then also, you overcame that physical injury kind of in the battlefield and those threats. But then, how do you deal with those criticisms that may not, or that those adversities that don't come from, I guess, the battlefield and more of like kind of civilian life? So people who would criticize you, whether it be your choices or just how you, I guess, look and all this other, hurdles that you have to overcome, just not in the military.
Well, that's maybe one of the few upsides of having returned to combat, is that everything else kind of has paled in comparison. It's very easy to be a civilian after you return to combat for 2 years minus an arm. So that's definitely a plus. It was like a huge weight lifted off my shoulder. And I'll be honest, most of the controversy that came after the fact came from myself. It was a battle to feel comfortable with people wanting to help. That is the biggest obstacle that I face, believe it or not, is people want to be helpful. I'm getting on a plane to go to an event and somebody sees me, about to lift my carry-on into the overhead bin, and they want to help me. And like in the beginning, I'd get annoyed. I'd be like, I can do that. I'm fine. But I learned to accept that for what it is, which is people are, for the most part, just very kind and genuine. And today, when somebody asks to help me with my carry-on, even though I don't need it, I smile and I accept it. And we are both happy at the end of that interaction. So again, I think it's mostly inside. It's overcoming the stuff in my own head, and the rest is just noise.
And Dan Bateman from the OVMA, a U.S. Army veteran, just asked, so you mentioned that hearing your parents discuss your return to combat served as a validation and encouragement that it could actually happen. So did their continued support play a factor in your ability to resume training and join the front lines again?
Oh yeah, I mean, you nailed it, Dan. You got to surround yourself with people that believe in you. You really do. Their continued belief in me, whether or not they wanted me to actually follow through, was a huge component to succeeding. And it happens in such like a nonchalant way sometimes. So like I got an email from my mom at one point, I think it was last year, and it was so casual. And she was like, "Hey, it's starting to get cold on the northern border." She knows that's where my unit in the reserves mostly serves. It's starting to get cold up north. ISIS is heating up in that region. You might want to get yourself some thermal underwear just in case you get called up for service. Like it went from being afraid to like having this like warrior mom, which makes me so happy. You know, she cares about me. She'd rather I didn't go, but she shows support in any way that she can.
So then also some more questions, I guess, to ask. So we know you as, you know, the battlefield kind of like, I guess, that hero, the person who's, you know, been through really a lot. But then who in your eyes, like who is Izzy in your eyes, you know, beyond the squad commander, inspirational speaker, who do you see, like, you know, who is Izzy?
I don't know, Brian, how deep do we want to go? It's a deep question.
Yeah,
I'm just a nerdy Jewish kid from Miami who decided to do one thing that turned out to be special. I followed an opportunity to the end of its path, and well, obviously, I'm not happy with what happened. I'm happy with the way that I handled it. Yeah, I mean, nobody wants to go through something like that. I wish we didn't need soldiers on any battlefield to begin with, but that's just not the reality of the world. And if it's going to happen, I'm glad that I could have been there to take part and do my best to keep things as civil as possible, regardless of the situation.
And then nowadays, actually, we have a question coming up in the chat. So, how did you decide to pursue public speaking and writing a book to tell your story?
So the public speaking I was kind of forced into. I'm a very shy person by nature. I don't like being in front of a crowd. This is actually a lot easier because all I have to do is look at Brian's face while I'm talking. Feels like a one-on-one. Very shy, just got asked too many times to do it and realized that there was a potential to use what happened to me to do more good. So I leaped on it. The book was something I was excited to write, and it ended up taking like 7 years and 3 different drafts, and was a total headache. And I'm glad that I didn't know how tough it was going to be at the beginning, because I probably wouldn't have seen it through. But without that, I wouldn't have learned to write the way that I write now, and I wouldn't be pursuing my next career, which is screenwriting. That's why I moved to LA. So I'm trying to write movies for the big screen. So hopefully you guys will see something of mine in the future. That would be nice.
And I think you briefly mentioned, or actually pretty extensively, about how it's kind of like an uphill battle to return to that battlefield. And as a lot of as all the cadets here, we're going to be, you know, some of us may very well be, the people in charge of decisions like that, you know, being officers in the military. So what is kind of that piece of advice for those future officers, you know, being on that enlisted side? You know, what are the things that, you know, create those toxic leaders, but what are those really good examples that you've seen in your time in the service of like really good standout officers?
Well, it's fitting that I'm about to say, because of the fact that I just told you that I moved to Hollywood to write movies. But I would point you to I don't know if you guys have seen Band of Brothers. It would be a total shame if this group of people has not seen that miniseries. But just be a Captain Winter. Don't be that guy from Friends. What's his name? You know, I'm talking to David Schwimmer. Don't be his character. That's not the kind of officer you want to be. Yeah, lead by example. In Israel, we're big fans of leading from the front. So don't put your soldiers through anything that you wouldn't be willing to do yourself. You know, it's the small things like I don't know if there are parallels between the Israeli military and the U.S. military in this way, but when I'd bring my soldiers to the mess hall, I'd make sure that everybody got their food first and started eating before I touched my plate. And sometimes it's the smaller things like that that make the biggest impression. Your soldiers will notice that kind of thing when you care about them and take care of them first. You know, yeah, the small things. And it's a great show. If you guys haven't watched that show, please, please, please watch it.
See if anyone else has questions in the chat here for us.
Ronan, you're awfully quiet up there. Any questions from you?
Yeah, and thank you for giving me the space. I'm actually wonder again, like you've moved from here, you grew up in Miami. Okay, fine, you did amazing, you did Aliyah, but you're still, it's hard enough to join, you know, to draft the army in general, going from civilian life in the age of 18, 19, whatever, and join a military service in the military life. But how is it to join a military life in a different culture? And you spoke about the language. So obviously the language is a huge barrier. But in addition to that, there is a different culture. You know, I'm living here in the United States only for a year and a half now, so I understand the culture. And I wonder, how is it for you, you know, as American moving to Israel and joining to the most, you know, rough environment in the Israeli culture?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it was, I thought that the biggest barrier was going to be language. And I learned Hebrew very quickly, as I mentioned. I think I was speaking comfortably within 3 months of joining, again, because of all the ensuing punishments for not knowing what was going on. It really was the culture that turned out to be the most difficult obstacle to come across. And it came from a direction that surprised me. So I ended up, there are some units like the paratroopers in Israel that are very American heavy or volunteer heavy, where they're kind of used to facilitating and having join, you know, people from other countries. But I ended up in a unit that really didn't have that type of setup. And also most of the soldiers just didn't speak English. And the question that I got most towards the beginning is why did I volunteer in the first place? Almost as like, what are you doing here? And that was kind of hard to bear, considering that I went there to volunteer. But it was the culture shock in general. The irony for me is that today I actually feel more comfortable in the military in Israel when I go back than I do as a civilian. I almost don't know how to be a civilian there. It's one of the reasons that I didn't stay. But yeah, that's a good point, Ronan, that it was the culture, not the language, that was the biggest barrier to kind of overcome and figure out. But by the time I went back, I was very comfortable. I felt very much at home. And in fact, I believe that by the time I got to my soldiers, it took a week or two before they even realized that I wasn't Israeli. And it's just because I messed up on something grammatical that an Israeli would never mess up on in Hebrew. Oh, I see we have
a lot of questions in the chat about your you know, upcoming Hollywood, I guess, ideas. So where did it just go? Oh yeah, are you planning to write military themed stories, or, you know, other, I guess, just other stories creatively, or?
Military, not so much. I'm kind of, I feel like I have to move on from that, take a little break from the military stuff. I mean, I get asked often enough why I'm not optioning my own story as a screenplay, but that's just because I'm kind of sick of writing about myself or hearing about myself. Yeah, other is the answer. I've decided in a very calculated way to start by writing horror movies, because they're famously like cheaper to shoot and can still make real box office hits, just because people like to be scared in crowds together, so they go to watch horror movies. So even though I can't watch them because they scare the living hell out of me, that's what I write. I read the scripts and I still get nightmares even without watching them, but horror is definitely what I'm focusing on at the moment.
And then there's actually a cadet who just asked something about kind of like I guess, the difference and similarities between the U.S. and Israeli military. So do you have an experience, I guess, talking with U.S. troops or training with U.S. troops or, guys, anything related to U.S. military?
No, and unfortunately, it would be hard for me to respond to that because I did spend 4 years in one military and don't really have that much experience with the other. I actually wish I talked to American soldiers more often. You guys are a wonderful bunch. So I don't have anything specific. I wouldn't know how to juxtapose between the two.
And then also, looks like the Syracuse alumni Gary Ginsberg just asked, did the loss of your arm limit the promotion in the IDF? Because I know, military, I guess you mentioned how it kind of phase out after, I guess, 3 years. That's kind of different than, I guess, the U.S. military where people will make careers out of it. So did losing that, arm limit promotion?
I think it's almost to the contrary. I think it would have been easier to have upward momentum because of it. Just because of the novelty of it, and also because the place where it is hardest to deal with something like that is as a grunt in the field. So an officer has to focus less on, his rifle and moving things around with two arms and more on command. So I think it's actually almost the opposite. I didn't really want to stay and continue on that path. But I don't think there would have been too many obstacles to going to officer school and making that happen if I had wanted to.
Another question would be, you mentioned growing up in an Orthodox home. Did what happened to you make you question your belief in God? Do you think he gave you strength to overcome your injury?
That is a complicated one. It gives me another opportunity to direct you to this guy, Disarmed. There is a chapter called Arm Wrestling with God that focuses on my thought process when I woke up in the hospital after the injury. I don't want to spoil it for you, but I will say it definitely shifted things for better or worse.
And then we have a question from our Lieutenant Colonel. So she first says, thank you for taking time to be with us today. And then her question specifically is, we talk a lot about resiliency in the U.S. Army, but find it very difficult in practice. So where do you believe you draw most of your strength from since being wounded?
Yeah, I mean, difficult in practice is the best way to put it. It's so hard to do. And I think I mentioned earlier that there is no like aha moment and now suddenly you're resilient. It's literally just working that muscle, and every time that new obstacle smacks you in the face, you just get up and keep moving forward. There's no easy answer to that. And every obstacle comes at you in a different direction and has a different amount of force, and you just have to stay on top of it. But I will say that asking that question already, it shows a promising results, the fact that you care enough to ask that. Resiliency is hard. Told you, I still cry at paper cuts. I don't know about cry, maybe cry is extreme. Still complain about it. That actually may be a good place to bookmark this. Me mentioning that I cry at paper cuts. I think maybe this is where we can come to a close, if that's okay with Ronan. Once again, I want to thank you guys for giving me the opportunity to speak to a group of people that I respect. I will say this, I don't know if it's premature, but I thank you guys for your service. I have tremendous respect for the U.S. Armed Forces, whatever branch you're coming from or going to. And I wish you all sincere luck. And Ronan, if you want to throw my email address in the search bar at some point, you guys are welcome to reach out at any point throughout your service. You have an open invitation to, if you want to talk something through with me or shout at me for lying to you about resiliency or whatever it is while you're going through something. But it really was a sincere honor to speak with you guys. And I thank Hillel and Ronan for making it happen. So with that, I'm going to leave you. I'm going to go hang out with my dog Punch, take him for a walk. And that's all.
I will. Thank you so much, Izzy, for being here with us, sharing your story and answering our questions. And I also want to thank, obviously, Cadet Bauer for being here, asking your questions, helping prepare this event, and all of you. And of course, the Office of Veterans and Military Affairs and the ROTC programs. Again, as Izzy said, you're doing an amazing job. And all of you for being here tonight, sharing with us from students, cadets, or community members, or alums, of course. Thank you all.